Good morning. Thank you for joining us today for our webinar. My name is Stephanie Christopher. I am the Program Director for MDIC's Science of Patient Input Initiative, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here today. I'm very excited because today we're presenting the first in a three-part series of webinars from some terrific experts in the field of patient preference assessment. Many of you are aware that patient preferences are a growing area of interest both for the medical devices industry and also for CDRH. But there still remain a lot of questions on the part of our medical device industry members of how to best approach these studies. So I'm delighted to be able to present this webinar today and to be able to turn it over to our terrific set of speakers. We will have time at the end of this webinar for questions. And we do also have a representative from CDRH who will be on the line to answer any questions as well. So I hope that you learn a lot today, and if you have questions, use the chat box to send those in, and we will hopefully have plenty of time at the end for a good discussion. So with that, I'd like to introduce our three speakers today. Shelby Reed is a professor at the Duke School of Medicine. Reed Johnson is also a professor at the Duke School of Medicine, and Juan Marcos Gonzalez is an assistant professor at the Duke School of Medicine, and have really played a leadership role in helping the medical devices industry to better understand the world of patient preference studies. So with that, I will turn it over to our speakers, and I will pass the keyboard control over as well, Juan Marcos, so you should be able to take it away.
Thank you. Actually, the first presenter is going to be Reed Johnson.
Thanks, Stephanie. Well, we're pleased to be able to present the first of three webinars on quantitative patient preference data. So we're, oops, Stephanie, did you give me control? It's not advancing, Stephanie.
Sorry about that. I will go ahead and advance and try that once again. You should have control of it now. If you click on the screen once, there you go.
There we go. Okay. Sorry. All right. We don't. Juan Marcos, I think, had already worked out all of this, and then I walked in a little late. So the title of our presentation today is From Stories to Evidence. Much of what patient engagement involves is kind of qualitative interactions to try to understand the patient experience, and that can be extremely valuable. But what we'd like to focus on in these three webinars is how to quantify those stories, that is to actually convert the patient experience into evidence that could be used in much the way clinical evidence is used in regulatory reviews. Well, everyone has been swept up in the patient-centered healthcare movement. It takes lots of different forms in different countries and within the United States in different contexts. We are interested in the question of how the different forms of patient engagement give us opportunities to assess relative importance of value judgments. Now, the problem with value judgments is that we kind of delegated them to different groups. Largely in health, value judgments about the relative importance of benefits and risks, for example, have largely traditionally been turned over to clinicians. And sometimes, of course, politicians intervene to make things more complicated. But the question is, what is the role for patients? There is kind of an ethical standard here that's widely accepted, that we shouldn't do things to patients without obtaining their informed consent. And informed consent logically would also apply to their willingness to accept therapeutic risks in return for benefits. In economics, the kind of ethical basis for all of modern welfare economics before psychologists began to call themselves behavioral economists is that individuals are the best judge of their own welfare. So if we're really interested in obtaining these value judgments, then it makes sense to incorporate the patient perspective along with these other perspectives. I have a quote here from Rob Califf, former FDA commissioner, that patient preferences are critical in determining when a product's benefits outweigh their costs. There was also a co-authored manuscript published in JAMA in 2015 by Rob Califf, where he points out that FDA's guidance on benefit risk determinations for device approvals is going to be an explicit factor the agency may consider in approval decisions. This was an important step in getting FDA public acceptance of the principle of patient preference data. Let's see, can we get this to Stephanie? No. We didn't try to, there's an audio attached to this. Yeah. I'll just read it. We actually have Rob's voice here. But at the release event for the guidance back in 2015, Rob Califf was one of the speakers, and he said, "You don't know people's preferences unless you ask them. How do people look at these differences?" And I fell in love with the discrete choice experiments, which I had heard about from the business school, but had not seen in action. And I think that provides major advantages. So this is a great day for me. It's been a long time. Who would have thought it would have come from the device world? There was some laughter after that statement. I think it's a major triumph for the device world that we're here today, not just talking about it, but with the FDA very involved. To the extent that FDA takes preferences seriously, I think it's a great day. So there's a little bit of history here. MDIC was co-founded in 2013 by CDRH and industry members. A year later or so, CDRH sponsored a pilot obesity preference study. Juan Marcos and I were working at RTI at the time as a kind of a demonstration project for, or a test of concept. It wasn't, no one knew exactly what would, how it might be used. But we did a stated preference study on obesity devices, which turned out to be, I think, pretty successful, and ended up being used in a regulatory review of a device that got approval in January of 2015, a weight loss device that had failed its primary trial endpoints. And the stated preference data that we had obtained on patients' willingness to accept risks indicated that patients actually would be willing to accept the benefits that were obtained in the trial, given the risks involved. So that was, I believe, the first obesity device that had been approved in 7 or 8 years. Then the draft of the guidance came out a few months later, final guidance in 2016. Also in 2016, there were the CDRH's strategic priorities. And one of the strategic priorities was to increase the use and transparency of patient input as evidence in decision-making. And specifically, they indicated that all de novo and HDE decisions will include a summary of available and relevant patient perspective data that was considered. In 2017, another device was approved. This was a hemodialysis, a home hemodialysis device that had additional risk, but also potential additional benefits because patients would be able to use the device more frequently than they would if they went into a center. Let me move along here. So it isn't the case that preferences are necessarily essential for informing all regulatory decisions. So in the case of weight loss devices, my pointer doesn't work, does it? You can't see my pointer? I don't think
No, we
so.
can't.
Okay. So up in the northeast quadrant of this, we have devices. This is a very invasive surgical procedure that would result in considerable weight loss, but also high risks. And way down in the southwest quadrant, we have diet and exercise that produces almost no weight loss, but also has no risks. And then there's pills that maybe offer a little more risk and a little more weight loss. But there is something sort of between these surgical interventions and pills, diet, and exercise that has lower risks than surgery and but also less weight loss. And it's not really clear at what point the efficacy that's offered justifies the risk associated with it. And that's the question really that our study was designed to answer. Juan Marcos is going to talk about that a little later. But as I mentioned, there was a device that was approved in 2015. It was a kind of it was an implantable device that is a vagus nerve stimulator that was designed to suppress appetite. And as I indicated, it was the first device approved since 2007. And it was the first approval to be a result of CDRH's Patient Preference Initiative. So the guidance that was issued in final guidance in August 2016, no, I'm sorry. Yes. Yes. Indicates that FDA understands that patients and care partners who live with the disease may have developed their own insights and perspectives on the benefits and risks. So what are preferences then? They have their own perspectives, which is fine. That could be qualitative or quantitative, but we're going to focus here today on preferences. So this is the statement that was included in the MDIC framework report that was published in 2015. So there are some terms here we'd like to define. We're interested, preferences can be either qualitative or quantitative. Qualitative are essentially stories, anecdotes from individuals. Quantitative is evidentiary, that is, representative of a group collected in a way that this is not the corrected version of this slide. Oh well, we're all looking at each other because we fixed this, and then it's unfixed here for some reason. Okay. Statements, I'm sorry these aren't lining up. They did this morning, but now they don't. Statements, we can obtain those from surveys if we're going to do it quantitatively. And then there is the question of relative desirability or acceptability, which is defined by economists think about it, as being defined by what people are willing to give up in return for something else. And then this is supposed to be pointing to attributes, which are characteristics or features. And then interventions that can be not only interventions, but could be health states, processes of caregiving, maybe convenience features of a product, and other kinds of things. Anything that you can describe in terms of attributes and construct trade-off questions can give us this kind of data. The various approaches that are available to us, there are a lot of them. The framework document, the MDIC framework document contains a catalog of literally all the possible approaches that are available. And then you can group these kind of into qualitative methods, things like focus groups and public meetings, and there are things that we can learn from that. Or simple quantitative methods such as ranking or what's called the threshold method, or sometimes called the willingness to pay method, that can help in prioritization and if there are very simple trade-offs involved. But more advanced quantitative methods, which we're going to focus on in these three webinars, include things like choice experiments and best-first scaling. This is where we have trade-offs that involve more than two outcomes, where we require statistical preference measures of things like risk tolerance, minimum acceptable benefit, time equivalence, or maximum acceptable risk, or risk as a measure of risk tolerance. And for use in to inform regulatory decisions, we have to produce something that looks like evidence, that is publishable, peer-reviewable, evidence that would stand up to scientific scrutiny. We're going to focus specifically today on what are called discrete choice experiments. A reaction often when we begin talking to companies about these kinds of studies is that this seems like an awfully new and unfamiliar thing. But the truth is that this is the basic methods that we're working with have been developed over 4 decades. Initially in market research, and later to deal with more complicated problems of public goods and non-market goods in transportation planning and environmental economics, and then in the last 10 or 15 years, let's say, in health. A guy at Berkeley named Dan McFadden got the Nobel Prize in Economics in 2000 for the conceptual and statistical foundations of these stated purpose studies. This commitment to patient-centered healthcare has created an opportunity to apply the methods that were developed and applied in other areas to health. So here's an example of what a stated preference question looks like, a discrete choice experiment question looks like. This was a study we did in cystic fibrosis that focused on comparing a nebulizer with a much more convenient device. So we have a sort of a picture of the device. One of the challenges of applying these kinds of studies to devices is that you've got to somehow explain how this device works, ideally in a situation where they could actually, if it's something that involves manipulation by the patient, something they could actually look at and feel and operate. But if not, we have to be able to explain what the device is and how it works. Then there are some other attributes. That is basically what are the convenience factors? In this case, how much time it's going to take each day for taking the medicine, and that includes cleaning it between times. How often you have to use it. And then whether there's a dry cough side effect. It turns out that the handheld device is a powdered, and there is some patients who experience a cough. And then personal costs. And the question is, if these were the only alternatives available, which of these treatments would you choose? Treatments are labeled here just treatment A and treatment B. In some cases, we would include a neither option. I wouldn't do anything. I wouldn't stick with whatever I'm currently doing. But for cystic fibrosis treatment, you are going to have to use some sort of inhaled device to control lung infections. Okay, so these discrete choice experiments are sometimes known or called choice-based conjoint analysis. As we've seen, the alternatives consist of combinations of features We assume and are able to observe that preferences among alternatives depend on the relative importance of the features. We offer respondents questions that offer them choices among hypothetical alternatives. And the pattern of those choices, if we're smart about the way we design them, reveal the relative importance of the features when we apply certain statistical analysis. So let's take a look at some steps in a basic choice experiment study. I'm going to go through this very quickly today. Next time, we will go through these steps in much more detail. So first of all, we have to just define the attributes or the features. In a benefit risk study, the endpoints would be efficacy and adverse events. We take those features and we develop a survey, which involves, first of all, defining each of the endpoints in user-friendly, patient-friendly language, design the choice task layout. I gave you an example just now. We then conduct a series of pre-test interviews, and we use those to refine the instrument until it works. Then we need an experimental design, which is how we're going to combine all of the possible combinations of attributes and levels into choice tasks that will generate the data necessary necessary to analyze to produce the preference weights. Juan Marcos will show you an example of preference weights in a minute. There are lots of points in the product life cycle where patient preference data can be useful. Much of the focus recently has been on applications to benefit risk assessments, but FDA is also interested in other possible applications, and there are non-regulatory product development and marketing applications for which this kind of evidence is of interest. For example, in clinical development, it would be useful sometimes to obtain weighted endpoints or some sort of prioritization. There may be often PRO data, but the problem with PRO instruments is that they are not experiments. I provided some answers to some questions for an ISPOR publication that just came out today, where they asked what's the difference between a PRO and a discrete choice experiment. I said discrete choice experiments do not provide outcome information, and PROs are not experiments. They do different things. But there is a connection between the two. So PRO instruments employ a scoring algorithm. And basically you take the Likert indicators and just basically sum them up across scales and domains and come up with a score. And it just basically it's adding up. You can come up with separate scores, adding up scores for each of the domains, and then adding up across the domains. It's just adding up. So you end up with a linear relationship. So if, for example, you have none, mild, moderate, and severe as the Likert scale, it'll just assume that the distances between those levels of severity are equal. Well, in a study we did on a particular instrument, this was the European Organization for Research and Treatment of Cancer, EORTC Quality of Life Questionnaire. We converted it into a discrete choice experiment. And guess what? The distances in the various domains, in this case it's physical, role, and social, are not linear. They are not the same. You can't just add them up. If what you're trying to get at is the relative importance from a patient perspective of these different levels of severity for physical, role, and social. We actually got the study got the Article of the Year award in Quality of Life Research that year. And we demonstrated that it was possible to come up with qualitatively different results if you use the standard PRO scoring algorithm or you use the patient-weighted algorithm. All right, I'm going to turn this over now to Juan Marcos to talk about the weight loss device study.
Okay. Thank you, Reed. And as Reed mentioned, the second use of preference information that I'm going to discuss is perhaps the most widely associated with the FDA patient preference initiative, because it is basically within the purview of or the clear mandate that FDA has in terms of the evaluation of benefits and risks of treatments and devices, and it is the component of preference information that helps in that process. So let me just start by explaining. I'm going to take a sort of a step back here and talk a little bit about the benefit-risk problem that CDRH and other centers have as they're evaluating evidence from sponsors on medical treatments and devices. And in essence, they're faced with the question about whether a specific combination of benefits and risks in this bundle in the form of a device is approvable or not. And so you will have, or they will see devices that will have very high risk and low level of efficacy, and devices that might have high level of efficacy or low level of risk, and sort of everything in between. And so their challenge is to draw sort of a line above and below which something is considered to be approvable or not. And so that line, as Reed mentioned before, is really a judgment. And that judgment largely takes place without much discussion outside of the sort of the regulatory decision process, and in some cases even within reviewers' heads. And of course, we expect that there's some discussion about those judgments as the evaluation takes place. But it doesn't necessarily occur in a way that is evident to the sponsors who are presenting the evidence to FDA. And so one way in which we could identify what FDA or CDRH is thinking when it comes to these evaluations of benefits and risks is if we had enough information in terms of what devices are approved and what devices are not, we could sort of plot those in terms of their benefits and risks, and based on the decisions associated with each device, we could draw that regulator's benefit-risk threshold. What is that relationship or that judgment between the impact of benefits and risks? And so we could define sort of a zone within which we can expect devices wouldn't be approved, based on their benefit-risk relationships, and another zone where we would expect devices would be approved. So the things in the extremes, you can imagine, are probably pretty easy things to determine whether they're approvable or not. The problem, though, comes when things are sort of around that threshold. And it is because likely that threshold that we've drawn here as a line is not quite like that, because as you get closer to that threshold, you can expect to see that the judgment about the relationship between benefits and risks among the different reviewers is not going to be unanimous, right? And so these situations where the judgments become a little bit more tricky based on sort of the closeness of the impact of benefits and risks is what I call sort of the neighborhood of preference sensitivity. It's sort of the area where it becomes really critical to bring information that can help regulators, or at least provide information to regulators about not only sort of that clinical evidence and the benefits and risks, but also what patients think about that evidence, and in a way draw for regulators what is the patient perspective on that threshold. Now that threshold, of course, there's no reason why it would have to be the same as that of the regulators. We would expect that it's likely different, and it may be different in a way that is qualitatively irrelevant, because it leaves all the approval decisions or non-approval decisions intact as evaluated by the reviewers. But of course, that may not be the case, and in some cases, it may be that the patient's judgment or the caregiver's judgment, depending on whose views are relevant in this process, might indicate that the patient would have a different perspective on what devices should be approved, given the profiles of benefits and risks. And that, of course, can vary in many different ways. So, sort of to reiterate what Reed mentioned earlier, patient preference information or caregiver preference information, although it's becoming more relevant, and FDA has signaled that they are more willing to consider the information, is not always necessary. And in the context of benefit-risk evaluations, it is really a tool that is primarily helpful in situations where there is no obvious decision to be made based on benefits and risks. In the case of obesity, that was the case in part because there was such little history in terms of approvals that there was little to go by in terms of what would constitute an acceptable trade-off between benefits and risks. And so when CDRH approached us to help with this proof of concept, looking at patients' preferences for weight loss devices, they were really looking for us to answer the question, what does this threshold line look like in this population among patients who would be eligible to take or receive these devices? And so in order to answer that question, we constructed a discrete choice experiment. And the choice question that was presented to respondents looked exactly like this. We actually present multiple questions like this, where you can see how we are defining alternatives based on their features. These features are listed in the leftmost column. And we explain respondents under each device how each alternative performs under these features or attributes, and ultimately ask respondents to make a decision. Now, the values highlighting or demonstrating the performance of each device they see in each question is controlled experimentally, and it's done so in a way that forces respondents to make trade-offs as they're making one choice over the other. And so the experimental design, what it's doing is that it is ensuring that we have the statistical power here, the statistical information rather, to use the choices that we record for each respondent across this series of questions to be able to tell what is driving their decision and to what extent each of these features is driving that decision. The more an attribute is driving a decision to choose a weight loss device, the more important that attribute is expected to be. And so with this information, after analyzing it using regression methods, we're able to produce what we call preference weights. And these preference weights are basically an indication of intensity of preference. The weights themselves have no interpretable meaning, but rather the difference between weights is interpretable as the value of a trade-off. And let me explain a little bit how that works in this graph. The horizontal axis in this figure shows each of the attributes that were included in this discrete choice experiment for the weight loss device study. And the specific values on the axis represent the levels within these attributes. Now, you have to think about what I said earlier when I described how we generate these questions. We're trying to create questions that require trade-offs. Now, it'd be great if we could show all possible trade-offs to each respondent, but of course, as you include or increase the number of trade-offs that you want respondents to consider, you also have to increase the number of questions. And so we are only able to evaluate these trade-offs for a finite number, a rather limited number of levels, which are the values that signal the performance under each attribute for the devices offered. And so on the horizontal axis, you see each of those values that were considered. You can think of these levels as sort of a menu of performance levels or outcome levels that were possible or feasible based on or in the questions that were presented to respondents. On the vertical axis, we have the preference weights scale, which again, each value is not necessarily or not directly interpretable, but rather the vertical distance between the points within an attribute. So for instance, if you look at weight loss percentage, which is this first attribute to the left, and evaluate the vertical distance between a 0% weight loss, which is in essence no device, and a 30% weight loss, that is associated with this vertical distance that I'm highlighting here with the red arrow. That is close to, say, 4.5 units, okay? Now, if you now contrast those units against the risk of death, which is shown on the last attribute here to the right, then you can see what would be the equivalent increase in that risk that would be associated with the same intensity of preference, or what we call importance. And so that relationship that we're able to uncover through these preference weights is what we call an equivalence measure, and it's what provides us with a threshold or sort of what we call maximum acceptable risk if we are taking the weight loss, say, as given and evaluating the risk that would offset or eliminate the benefits of the weight loss. Or the minimum acceptable benefit if we're doing it the other way around and we're evaluating a known level of risk and trying to understand how much weight loss respondents would require to offset that level of risk. In this particular case, you can see that 30% weight loss, given the results that we have, would be associated to about, would have approximately a maximum acceptable risk of 1.2% chance of mortality. And so this, of course, is not limited to mortality and is not limited to weight loss. You can establish these equivalence relationships with any attribute included in the design in the discrete choice experiment. And so you can already see how if you were to evaluate all of these different equivalences, you can create a long list of equivalence values, some of which will be meaningful to some reviewers, others will be meaningful potentially to others. And so in order to avoid just having this laundry list of equivalences, in addition to the presentation of the results that you see here, we also developed a little tool that in essence does all the calculations about these equivalences in the background and allows the user to specify what is sort of the clinically relevant profile they want to evaluate and what is the maximum acceptable risk for that profile, representing a device, real or not, or what is the minimum acceptable benefit required from that device, again, real or not. The characteristics of the device are defined there in the upper left portion of the user interface, where the user could just select the levels under each of the features. Keep in mind that those levels would be the same ones that I listed before, mentioned before in the results. And then output in this case, we're showing the minimum acceptable total body weight loss, which is in essence a minimum acceptable benefit level. Now, because we ask multiple questions to each respondent, we're able not only to get the average equivalence value or risk tolerance value, but we are also able to calculate how does that average changes across your sample. And so we are able to get a sense of the distribution of that risk tolerance. And so for that reason, that of course is an important piece of information if you're trying to understand how many people would potentially benefit, not just whether the average patient would benefit from a specific device. And so we incorporated some tools on the right end, the upper right corner of the user interface to allow the user to change what portion or percentile of the distribution would either be perceiving the benefits of the device to exceed the harms, or what would be the maximum acceptable risk or minimum acceptable benefit associated with that specific part of the distribution. Finally, and I don't necessarily need to go into too much detail in the bottom section, it just explains graphically how the value of the device that is set up here in the tool, how the value changes with every given attribute that is considered and the levels that were entered for that attribute in the device. Okay. So I'm going to let now Shelby take over the next part of the presentation.
Okay, thanks so much. It's a pleasure to talk with you all today. So I'm going to take us through these last three areas where we believe preference assessment can be useful. This is sort of, maybe moving into the frontier of how these data can be applied to evaluate value of new medical products, how they can be used to generate, patient-sensitive treatment recommendations, as well as how they can be used in clinical practice. So we'll start with value frameworks. Many of you may be aware that there's been a lot of excitement, a lot of discussion around new value frameworks to evaluate new medical technologies. I think we can point to the American Heart Association and the American College of Cardiology as sort of the first mover in this area. They stated that when they were going to develop treatment recommendations, that they would take into account published cost-effectiveness analyses to make qualitative statements about the relative value of different treatments and technologies that are available. And then, as you know, as everyone is aware, a high cost of cancer treatments is of great interest. And so we have three movers there from Memorial Sloan Kettering, ASCO, and NCCN who have put forth their own frameworks, and I'll talk about those in a moment. And then we also had ICER, the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review, sort of, came on the scene. They are playing a large role in the sort of national debate around use of cost effectiveness and evaluating the value and budget impact of new technologies. Faster Cures is another initiative working with Avalere, particularly looking at rare diseases. They're putting their own value framework together that is patient-centered. We had the new U.S. panel book come out in the end of 2017, and then we have ISPOR Special Task Force generated its own value framework, and Pharma Foundation is spending $1 million this year to launch Center of Excellence and to fund some research awards to evaluate new aspects of value. So the ACC, AHA guidelines, the U.S. panel, and ICER, they all, use a traditional approach to evaluating cost effectiveness, where they're evaluating the incremental cost of a new treatment versus standard care over its improvements in quality adjusted life years. That's really the standard approach that has been used. But generally what these new value frameworks are addressing is that they believe that there are other important elements of value beyond costs and clinical benefits that are represented in traditional cost effectiveness analysis. What I'm showing here is a schematic that was adapted from some work Lou Garrison had done, Peter Newman, where they have offered additional elements of value that might be useful in different contexts, not for every cost effectiveness analysis, but certainly, for instance, value of knowing is important in regard to use of diagnostics in medicine. Equity is concerned just in terms of allocating resources fairly across society. Value of hope is something that we actually are applying a discrete choice experiment to evaluate, the willingness of people to sort of take a chance on a therapy that might give them significantly longer or more durable effects, particularly in cancer care. Options value is also a consideration. That's the idea where if someone can take a treatment now that might allow them to live long enough to take advantage of new technologies that offer even greater impact, there's some value in that. And people could argue the merits of each of those different aspects. So just taking a look at the ASCO value framework, I don't want to spend a lot of time on it, but essentially what they've done is they've identified different features that are important to evaluating value, and they've assigned a range of scores that can be applied to each of these, and they get added up. And there's really not an empirical basis for the weight that is given to each of these. They argue that this can be used to promote discussion between caregivers, clinicians, and patients, and that's how it should be used. So the Peter Bach from Memorial Sloan Kettering had put forth the drug abacus designed to determine what a sort of fair monthly price for a given cancer treatment should be. And in order to generate that monthly price, one has to enter in, these different elements. How much is a year of life worth? That's a challenging one. But it also gets a discount for toxicity, ranging from 10 to 30%. And then there are these multipliers. Multipliers on these different aspects that, a lot of experts think that should go into generating a fair price for new treatments, and that is novelty, rarity, patient burden of disease, and cost of development. And I'm just pointing this out to show that, in fact, these weights have a huge impact on what is considered a fair monthly price. But again, there's no empirical basis for those weights or the ranges that are provided. People can just select whatever they'd like. And that is to say that these methods that we're presenting provide a means of being able to generate those weights for different stakeholders. We can certainly imagine that physicians may have a different set of weights than patients would, than maybe a regulator or policymaker would. So these methods are very flexible and can be used to generate these weights that are critical for making these tough decisions. So now I want to move on to talking about some work that we did with University of Pennsylvania on a PCORI-funded project in Crohn's disease. So this project was designed as a comparative effectiveness analysis comparing benefits and harms of TNF-alpha inhibitors to use of corticosteroids in Crohn's disease. And so the issues that we're weighing here, particularly with TNF-alpha inhibitors that had been associated with a higher risk of cancer, but had benefits in terms of allowing people to have more time in remission, to use less corticosteroids, and to have a lower risk of infection compared to use of corticosteroids. So we were evaluating, what is the maximum acceptable risk of cancer that patients would be willing to accept in order to have these improvements in outcomes and reducing the risk of other events. So this is an example of a choice task that we used in the DCE. The treatment features included the number of months with in remission, mild, moderate, and severe Crohn's disease, the number of months that people would have to take corticosteroids over a given year, and then we had some risks of serious infection, risk of cancer, and then the chance that one may have to undergo surgery for their Crohn's disease. So we worked with the CCFA registry. We obtained data from, I think, around 700 or maybe 700 or 900 people with some different subsamples. So we had a lot of data to use. And the way that we had the preferences from the DCE and the attributes that I had described, and we were able to combine those preference weights with real-world data from Medicare and Medicaid claims that were able to be used to identify the same attributes. So these were embedded in a simulation model and also applied directly to the real-world data, just two different approaches to doing that. So what we had generated out of the preference data were time equivalents. As Juan Marcos described, we can estimate preference weights in terms of maximum acceptable risk, where risk serves as the numeraire. In this case, we use time in remission as the numeraire, or the metric that we could use to sort of translate between the other features that we included. And so what we found was that for the overall group, TNF-alpha inhibitors provided 5.5 remission equivalent months compared to corticosteroids providing 3.7. But then we also found that with latent class analysis, we identified subgroups of patients who prioritized benefits more than risks. We identified another subgroup who prioritized risks, prioritized not being on corticosteroids. They were like our steroid haters, and they really wanted to be off them as much as possible. They also, when we accounted for benefits and risks, preferred TNF-alpha inhibitors, and then we had a group that was very risk-averse with regard to cancer. Okay, so this represents those results. Again, I won't belabor that. So I think what is really kind of the advance here is that with traditional comparative effectiveness research, investigators will summarize the evidence, and then they'll provide a summary table that represents the relative advantages and disadvantages of alternative treatment options. And, a schematic of that is shown here. And it's up to the reader or up to the clinician to evaluate whether net benefits are greater with treatment 1 or treatment 2. But the academics or the researchers, whoever, did the evidence review can say, great, we've done it. Here's our paper in the literature, basically you go figure it out. We think that with the preference weights, it allows us to identify a winner, essentially, incorporating patients' attitudes around benefits and risks, the rates at which those different events occur. We can identify which provides the greatest net benefit. And we believe that it is these types of analyses that are truly patient-centered that should be used for the basis of defining treatment guidelines. So as I mentioned previously, we had identified these different groups of patients in our Crohn's disease study. I mentioned earlier that we identified people who, traded off benefits and risks, which we generally assume that most people do. But with more analysis, particularly latent class analysis, we do identify these subgroups of patients. What is shown by the longer line, the longer black line for steroid duration are those people who really, really wanted to avoid use of steroids, and the green line shows those who were very much concerned about cancer risk. Okay, and again, the results across those three groups. And even though there were some folks who were very, very concerned about cancer risk, shown in the bottom row, in fact, the net finding was that TNF-alpha inhibitors provided greater remission time equivalent. Okay, and then I'm going to end with talking about how preferences can be elicited for use in medical decision-making. At Duke, we are very fortunate to work with a lot of clinicians around the university and the medical center. And they get very excited about working on these discrete choice experiments with us. And then they turn around and say, but how can I use it in my patients? This is great. I really want to know how I can use it. And we said, well, that's not really what we're doing. We're looking more at group level preferences or even subgroup level preferences with the latent class analysis. But they really want to use preferences as a diagnostic, as a, sort of an aid to discussion. We see that practice guidelines often point out how, providers should talk with their patients, allow them to express their goals and preferences. And these are peppered across different areas of medicine, particularly in oncology, but also in orthopedics, where many procedures are elective. So anytime you have an elective procedure, it's essentially preference sensitive. So what we have begun working on are these preference-based decision aids, where we do account for patient characteristics. We know from all the work that and the research that's been done that patient characteristics are associated with outcomes. We have to account for their disease characteristics. We may account for their occupation or other issues relevant to making a treatment choice. Then they go through a choice exercise, and I'll show you an example of that. We can embed the information that we've learned about a patient's disease characteristics or demographics into a decision model to generate person-level predicted outcomes. And then we combine those, like we did in the Crohn's study, to compute net benefits. Okay, so we worked with some orthopedic surgeons here at Duke on the development of a decision aid for first-time shoulder dislocation. This is a schematic of the choice task, or a choice task that individuals completed, where they were weighing off different outcomes and different process measures. So, and really trying to help the patient and the physician decide whether surgery was more appropriate or whether a course of physical therapy would be more appropriate for treatment of a first-time shoulder dislocation. So the attributes that were considered were, kind of limitations in activity, shortly after the surgery, out-of-pocket costs, sort of intensity of physical therapy, and the risk of a repeat shoulder injury, and whether they could return to sport or when they could return to sport. Okay. So based on the overall group of 374 individuals, we found that the most important attributes were out-of-pocket costs and the chance of a recurrent shoulder injury. And so we also identified a fair bit of heterogeneity across individual patients in terms of what was most important to them. You know, in sort of identifying that heterogeneity, it was recognized that we really needed to have individual patient-level preference weights. So we developed an app that collects the information on the demographics, contextual variables. As I mentioned, we generated then the patient-level predictions in terms of their treatment outcomes, and then the choice experiment allows the clinician to see what is the most important attribute to that particular patient, and then can have a good discussion with that patient. So we believe there are a lot of benefits to this approach just by going through the exercise where we take a lot of care in defining the different attributes. The patients come in better educated. They've really begun the thought process instead of just coming in saying, yes, yes, I want surgery, absolutely want surgery, without even considering any of the risks. It allows patients to begin kind of going through that decision-making process. It improves patient and provider communication. We believe that it leads to greater patient satisfaction because their concerns have been heard, they have better dialogue with their care providers, and we believe in many instances it would lead to better adherence and improved patient outcomes. We believe there are also benefits to the healthcare system itself. These tools can be used in triage to help, kind of use better time for the specialists, for surgeons in particular, to increase the efficiency of their clinic time. It also provides a means to document that a health system is delivering patient-centered care because the patient preferences would be part of their medical record. And also, as the healthcare system moves towards a more capitated or at-risk type of payment system, and we might see changes in practice patterns, perhaps even reduced rates of surgery. It allows the healthcare system to sort of justify why there might be changes in practice patterns. So that's it for me. I'm going to turn it back over to Juan Marcos to walk us through opportunities and challenges.
Right, and I'm going to be pretty brief here. We've talked for a while now, and I know that, well, I hope that there's some questions either for us or the folks at FDA. In essence, I guess we wanted to wrap up this by reiterating that turning stories into evidence has value, and it has value in different ways at different points in the product life cycle. We hope that this presentation has helped you understand not only how preference information, patient preference information can be useful and in some cases critical when it comes to the evaluation of benefits and risks of different medical technologies, but also when it comes to improving, say, the quality of your data by understanding the instruments that you may be using, maybe missing some component related to the patient perspective about the outcomes that they're reporting, or even post-marketing as you are trying to understand how patient preferences drive actual behavior in the marketplace and the decisions that patients make when they are faced with elective surgery or things that are as Shelby said, preference-sensitive decisions. The good news is that we have really good methods out there. There are lots of them. They're flexible, and they can provide sort of different angles around this, the same information, and depending on your need, you would choose one or several, depending on what you want to accomplish here. And another good news is that FDA and CDRH in particular is very engaged in exploring the uses of these methods and how they can help in their process, their internal processes in terms of making decisions, regulatory decisions, approval decisions, but perhaps beyond that, trying to bring more of the patient perspective into the whole process. The challenges remain that the methods are relatively unknown in this space, even though stated preferences have been used for years in other areas. They're still relatively new to health, and I emphasize the word relative because, I mean, we have been doing this work for a while. There's been great work done already, and it's been the case for years. It's just that the idea of using this information more formally in the regulatory process is more recent, and understandably there's a bit of confusion and perhaps skepticism about what these methods can provide in terms of enhancing the value of the product or enhancing the information that is delivered to FDA at the moment of a regulatory review. Okay, so I think with that we finish our part of the presentation. I do want to, before we go to the questions, just highlight that for the next two sessions, first we're going to be talking about discrete trace experiments, as we mentioned before, and how those can be implemented. Session number two will focus on the development of the instrument and all the challenges that relate to that process, from choosing the attributes and levels to preparing the questions and taking into account that iterative process that Reid described, where we pilot the instrument and make corrections based on the feedback that we get from respondents. And then the third session will focus on the analysis and reporting, again, all the different things that can happen and critical points to take into account as you're evaluating either producing or consuming these data. And so in that process, we're going to be talking about big picture items like defining the study objectives and the scope, also practical considerations like what kind of study team is required or skills are required to be able to successfully conduct one of these studies, and what does it mean to have a regulatory quality study, both in terms of the instrument development and the analysis and reporting. With the caveat, of course, that I think that the answer to that specific question, I think it's an ongoing, it's an evolving thing because we have so little experience, relatively little experience in that particular part of the process. But we have had some really good feedback, and the guidance itself that FDA and CDRH put out helped us understand what are sort of those minimum standards. Okay, so with that, I'll return the control to Stephanie. Thank you so much for your time today.
Great, thank you. And I want to thank all of our speakers here today for giving us a great overview of patient preferences and the different applications for them. So we do have a couple of questions that have started to come in. I'm going to take back control. There we go. I do want to mention to everyone that, yes, we did record today's webinar. We will be making the recording available, and I will let everyone know that was registered for the session when that recording is available. Our first question, I like the comparison of PROs and patient preference DCEs and would like to hear more on how they can be brought together to provide a better patient experience picture.
Okay.
Yeah, that's actually an excellent question. And there's a lot of confusion about similarities and differences. Clearly, both PROs and DCEs and other stated preference methods are obtaining information from patients. So it seems like, well, okay, they're just different ways of doing the same thing. But of course, PROs are designed to obtain clinical data on outcomes that can't be observed other than by asking patients, like pain. We have, so now at least, we have no way to measure pain other than to ask patients. There is a sort of a, so that's fine. There is a sort of a related question, and that is, what does pain or other PRO score in other domains, how does it affect people's life? And sometimes we get a kind of a generic quality of life score or satisfaction score. But there isn't very much information at all on what is important to patients. That is, maybe there's kind of the assumption that the more severe the outcome it is, the more important it is. But the only way to measure importance, as we said in our presentation, is what trade-offs are you willing to accept? That is, how important is it, or how severe is it relative to something else? And the scores are just, the standard PRO scores are not very helpful in doing that. So I think that first we need to acknowledge that they do different things, that they're different perspectives on the patient experience. But that isn't to say that we can't learn something from those perspectives that could be informative on the other perspective. For example, in health utility assessments, increasingly are being done using discrete choice experiments instead of other approaches that have been used in the past with sort of less clear scientific validity. We showed an example of where you can take a PRO instrument, and we've done this on 3 or 4 instances, and kind of recast it as a choice experiment to see what the actual patient perceived distances are between the various points on the Likert scales and across domains. And that can be very useful, I think, in making a transition between the clinical data and, but whether it's measured clinically or whether it's measured through PRO, to an understanding of what's important to patients.
I also wanted to add that one of the other areas where I've seen interest in sort of combining the two pieces is when you start looking at sort of minimum relevant changes in this PRO score. So one thing is to use the preference weights to incorporate the preferences into the scores. A related but slightly different thing is to take the scores as given and then evaluate how much does that score need to change in order to become a meaningful or have a meaningful impact on patients. Of course, that will depend upon many things, including if we're talking about, say, pain that is associated with a condition, that will depend potentially on the sort of the side effects that may be associated with the treatment that is dealing with pain, or vice versa, right? So that's where I think also patient preference information and discrete choice experiments and stated preference methods in general can also be helpful and combined.
Yeah, we had a job candidate come in last week in our department, a PRO researcher, who said that this is a big problem in PRO researches. That is, what is a meaningful difference in the scores? And she showed various statistical things that they were doing. I kept thinking, why is this so hard? This is what we do all the time. It did seem to me that that is a place where the two perspectives could be useful.
Great, thank you. I have another question here, and we might ask our FDA colleagues on the line to weigh in on this one as well. From an industry perspective, we get the question from team members of how do we share this data with regulators? Is it just in submission documents? And how can the data get translated from the benefit risk section of the submission to post-submission documents like the label?
Hi, this is Annie Saha from FDA. Obviously, it's going to be very specific based on the data and what the purpose of the patient preference study would be and what your research question is that you're trying to answer with the patient preference study. So really the best advice that we really want to hammer home to folks is come talk to us early and often, and if you want sort of a more formal regulatory advice, come in for pre-submission with the relevant review team, and then when you're doing that, ask to include Martin Ho and myself, Annie Saha, as part of the patient preference team, and we work with the review teams on what would be the best way or how to incorporate the patient preference study and use that in risk assessments. And we do leave open in the guidance that it could be labeling based on a preference study, but of course it's going to depend ultimately on the context of use of the patient preference study and how it relates to our benefit risk assessment and our decision making.
Great. Thanks, Annie. We have a question here about applications beyond the U.S. regulatory environment, and she asks, has there been any exchange on this topic between the presenters and European regulators, such as the European Medicines Agency?
That's a good question.
Yeah, we're not really experts.
We're not experts, but we have colleagues who are, and we have had dealings with the European systems. They are moving in a similar direction. There is guidance in Germany that that allows for the introduction of patient preference information in identifying the efficiency threshold. There are some of our colleagues in the UK are doing similar studies. NICE, it seems to be more interested in it than they used to be. Everyone is kind of moving forward cautiously. These changes are important and sometimes create some confusion and uncertainty, and I think all the regulatory agencies are proceeding cautiously.
I think, an indication of that is the IMI Prefer project. That is a public-private partnership. Number of pharmaceutical companies are involved, with some device companies may be involved, and that is they've undertaken a large initiative to evaluate, in what cases would a discrete choice experiment be most useful, to evaluate some of the methodological issues, to compare different approaches to quantifying preferences. And so there are a number of work streams that are going on with that, and the regulators are involved. The EMA is involved with that, and so they're learning. I think trying to determine how to incorporate patient preference, this type of data into their decision making.
Great, thank you. Do you have any recommendations for recruiting patients for DCEs?
Well, I think it's study by study. It really depends on whether it's a more prevalent condition, or whether it is, a rare disease. And in some cases, it's such a rare disease that we might have to think of a different approach. And we've had experience where we've worked with survey vendor panels when we've had a more prevalent condition. And we've also had experience enrolling patients through Duke, and we've had experience enrolling patients through patient registries and advocacy groups. So it is kind of study by study. We have to evaluate what the needs are in terms of the timing for the study, and sort of the access to patients.
One thing I wanted to mention was that for discrete choice experiments and a lot of these methods, the design is pretty complicated, and so they almost always need to, or is recommended that they're administered either online or through a computer. So that poses some challenges, but also provides some opportunities, because it allows us to, or whoever is implementing the study, to go beyond clinics and reach out to patients at their homes and have them complete these instruments online, which makes, particularly in cases where you have rare diseases, makes a big difference.
Yeah, I'd say it's an empirical question as to whether we get different preference weights when we go out to a vendor panel, or when we have patients we can identify in the clinic. Certainly the clinic will give us more rich clinical detail that clinicians are accustomed to seeing with clinical trial data that we wouldn't have available from a vendor panel. And so, there's sort of just pros and cons that would have to be, evaluated in any given study.
We'll talk about this more in the next webinar, actually, when we're talking about how to actually implement a choice experiment study.
Terrific. That's a great plug for our next webinar, which will take place on March 15th. I just want to put the dates up here on screen. We do have one more question. Going back to the discussion we had earlier on PROs and patient preferences, it says here, ISPOR just published an oncology article on personalized PROs. Is there personalized patient preference?
Well, I think in the last application when we were talking about using, preference-based decision aids, is representative of patient-level preferences.
So we can get at individual level, in theory, we can get at individual level patient preferences. It is not a simple thing to do, because you need to collect quite a bit of information, and that either means you ask a lot of questions, or you have a very efficient design that allows you to do that.
Or you have a very simple problem.
Yeah.
Or you have a very simple problem. That's right.
And a decision aid, it might be a relatively simple problem. There may be only 2 or 3
options available. Yeah.
So it's really, in that case, it's a matter of trying to understand why one option might be better for a person rather than just that it is.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, I'm just doing one final check here, but I want to thank all of you for joining us here today, and once again thank our panelists. As we mentioned at the beginning, this is a 3-part series, and we're excited to be able to continue the conversation next month. If you're registered for this one, you're registered for the next one, so you will get the email reminders and the link to the webinar, the next one to take place on March 15th. And the recordings will be available on the MDIC website. So thank you for joining us.